During the 1970s, inflation hammered American working families harder than any decade since the Depression. Grocery prices rose 40% between 1972 and 1979. Factory workers, coal miners, and farm families across the country faced a choice that no family should face, and they made something remarkable from almost nothing. These aren't just recipes, they're survival stories written in cast iron and flour. Today, we journey through 25 foods that kept poor Americans not just fed, but genuinely healthy in the 1970s. Some of them deserve a permanent place back on the American table. Chicken feet soup. No part of the chicken delivers more collagen, more gelatin, and more mineral content per cent spent than the feet, which sold for nearly nothing in 1970s butcher shops, and produced a broth so rich it's set to jelly in the refrigerator overnight. When chicken prices rose with the general inflation of the mid-1970s, families turned to the cuts that the mainstream market ignored. In Chinese immigrant communities in San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles, in Caribbean communities across the Northeast, and in African American communities throughout the South, chicken feet were not discards. They were the starting point. Clean the feet thoroughly and blanch in boiling water for 10 minutes. Discard that water. Cover with fresh water, add ginger, garlic, green onion, and a splash of rice vinegar, and simmer for 2 to 3 hours until the broth turns golden and dense. The gelatin content is extraordinary. The mineral content, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, comes from the bone itself dissolving slowly into the liquid. Salt pork and greens. Collard greens, mustard greens, and turnip greens, cooked low and slow with a piece of salt pork, produced what Southern grandmothers called pot liquor, the liquid left in the pot after the greens were done, and what nutritionists now recognize as one of the most mineral-dense preparations in American cooking. During the 1970s, a large bunch of collard greens cost 15 cents at farm stands across the South. Salt pork ran 20 cents a pound. The combination fed a family for 35 cents and produced pot liquor so rich in iron, calcium, and fat-soluble vitamins that rural Southern communities with access to backyard gardens consistently showed lower deficiency rates than urban communities eating processed convenience food. In African American communities across the Deep South, this was not humble food. It was the food. Bone broth soup. Families who had nothing had bones, and from bones they made something that modern wellness culture now sells for $8 a cup. During the 1970s recession, butchers across the Midwest sold soup bones for nearly nothing, 10 cents a pound in many markets, because their wealthier customers wanted only the cut, not the carcass. Working-class families understood what the wealthy customer left behind. When scarcity demanded creativity, they turned the remnant into the meal. Cover the bones with cold water, add a splash of vinegar to draw out the minerals, and bring everything slowly to a simmer with carrots, celery, onion, and whatever the garden offered. Let it go for 8 hours. The collagen breaks down into gelatin, the marrow releases into the broth, and what results is dense with calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus in a form the body absorbs completely. In Appalachian communities across eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, grandmothers made this every Sunday from the chicken carcass left after the week's one roast. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Every lawn in America in the 1970s was a food source, and the families who knew this ate better than the families who didn't. During hard times, when the week's produce money had already gone toward staples, women in Appalachian communities and Italian immigrant neighborhoods across the Northeast walked outside and harvested what was already growing. Dandelion greens, gathered in early spring before the flower appears, are bitter and rich with vitamins A, C, and K at levels that exceed commercial salad greens by significant margins. Italian immigrant families in the coal towns of Pennsylvania and West Virginia called these cicoria and gathered them every spring, the way their grandmothers had gathered them in Calabria and Campania. Slow-cooked oxtail stew. The wealthy ate prime cuts. The poor made meals from what remained: the neck, the feet, the tail, and sometimes what remained was better than what the wealthy had taken. During hard times, oxtail sold for almost nothing in 1970s butcher shops because its customers wanted nothing to do with it. In Caribbean immigrant communities in New York, in African American communities across the South, and in Italian immigrant neighborhoods in Boston and New Haven, the oxtail was not a remnant. It was the prize. Collagen-rich cuts cooked this way produce gelatin that supports joint health in ways that lean cuts cannot. Coal miners and factory workers whose bodies absorbed daily physical punishment ate this and recovered in ways their supervisors didn't. Today, fine dining restaurants charge $30 a plate for this dish and call it artisanal. Grandmothers in Flatbush and Harlem remember when it cost 50 cents a pound and nobody else wanted it. Sometimes, the best thing on the table is what nobody else thought to take. Liver and onions. Nothing in the American meat case was cheaper, more abundant, or more nutritionally dense in the 1970s than beef liver, and families who could afford nothing else could usually afford this. When steak became an impossible dream for working households during the inflation years, families turned to organ meats, cuts the wealthy found undignified, and the butcher had trouble moving. Beef liver sold for 39 cents a pound in 1974, while chuck roast ran over $1. The economics were simple. The nutrition was extraordinary. Liver contains more iron per ounce than any other common food, along with B12, folate, and vitamin A, in amounts that kept deficiency at bay through years of dietary scarcity. Factory workers in Cleveland, Gary, and Pittsburgh ate this once a week through the entire decade. Children often resisted, and parents insisted, for reasons the children wouldn't understand until they were grown and reading about the anemia rates in families that couldn't afford it. Sometimes, the most necessary thing on the table is the one that takes the most convincing. Pinto beans and rice. No combination of ingredients in American history has done more work for less money, and nutritionists now confirm what working families already knew. During hard times, and the 1970s brought hard times to factory towns from Detroit to Birmingham, dried pinto beans cost 25 cents a pound and contained more protein, iron, and fiber than most of what wealthier families were eating. When meat became unaffordable for weeks at a stretch, families turned to the bean pot. The recipe couldn't be simpler. Sort and rinse the beans, cover with water, and let them soak overnight. The next day, simmer low with a ham hock or a strip of fatback, onion, garlic, and black pepper for 3 to 4 hours until the broth turns silky. Cook long-grain rice separately. Serve one over the other. In textile mill towns across the Carolinas, this appeared on tables 5 nights out of 7 without apology. Children didn't know they were eating one of the most nutritionally complete meals their parents could have engineered. They knew it was warm, and the broth was good, and there was always enough. Vegetable soup from the garden. The backyard garden was not a hobby in working-class America of the 1970s. It was a food system. During hard times, families who had any yard at all planted it. Tomatoes, beans, squash, okra, sweet corn, collard greens, and potatoes grew in lots behind houses in Birmingham, Memphis, and Indianapolis. Cities not known for their agricultural tradition, but full of families one generation removed from rural roots who had not yet forgotten how to feed themselves from the ground. When produce prices rose with the general inflation, families turned to what grew outside the back door. The soup built itself differently each week, depending on what was ready. Tomatoes in July, okra in August, winter squash in September. A soup pot always on the back burner, always accepting whatever the garden offered that day. Buttermilk and cornbread. This combination strikes modern eaters as odd until they try it, and then it strikes them as the thing they should have been eating all along. The probiotics in cultured buttermilk and the cornmeal's B vitamins together made this a genuinely functional food dressed as a poverty meal. Children in Tennessee and North Carolina grew up with this as a summer supper staple, and only later understood that it was the solution to a grocery budget problem. At the time, it was simply cold and good, and the sound of the spoon against the glass was the sound of a summer evening ending. Homemade chicken stock with egg noodles. The whole chicken was the working family's most efficient purchase in 1970s America. One bird produced a roast, then a soup, then a stock, and finally a pot of noodles across 4 separate meals from a single purchase. When inflation squeezed grocery budgets in the mid-1970s, families turned to the whole animal economics their grandmothers had never abandoned. A 3-pound chicken cost 89 cents in 1973. Stretched across 4 meals for a family of 5, that was under 5 cents per serving, cheaper than anything a box could offer. Grandmothers in Polish and Czech immigrant communities across the Midwest called this the meal that came from the meal that came from the meal, a phrase that doesn't translate cleanly, but means something precise in the original. Nothing went to waste. The carcass was not waste. The neck and the gizzard and the back were not waste. Children learned early that food was a complete system, and waste was a luxury no working family could afford. Dried split pea soup with ham. Green and thick and deeply savory, split pea soup has fed working people through every American recession and emergency since the colonial era, and the 1970s were no exception. During hard times, a pound of dried split peas cost 29 cents and produced enough soup to feed a large family twice. When fresh vegetables became expensive and meat was a luxury item, families turned to the legume pantry. Not from ignorance, but from precise economic calculation. Split peas are among the highest protein, highest fiber foods available at any price. No soaking required. Cover the peas with water, add a split ham bone or a smoked ham hock, diced onion, carrot, celery, and pepper, and let everything simmer together for 90 minutes until the peas completely dissolve into the broth and thicken it to something you can almost stand a spoon in. Salt at the end after tasting, because the ham brings its own. Colcannon. Irish and Scots-Irish immigrant families across Appalachia and the industrial Northeast kept this alive through the 1970s without calling it by any particular name. It was simply what happened when you had potatoes and cabbage and not much else. Scarcity demands combination, and combination sometimes produces genius. Potatoes and cabbage together create a complete amino acid profile that neither alone achieves. Families who had no formal nutritional education were making this calculation through necessity and arriving at an answer that biochemistry later confirmed. In coal mining communities across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, where Scots-Irish families had settled generations earlier, this appeared on tables every Friday. Sometimes because of Catholic Meatless Friday tradition, sometimes simply because Friday was when the week's money ran lowest. Homemade bread. In 1974, a loaf of Wonder Bread cost 39 cents. A 5-pound bag of all-purpose flour cost 49 cents and produced 8 loaves. When grocery budgets collapsed under the weight of 1970s inflation, families who knew how to bake stopped buying and started making. The knowledge had skipped a generation in many households. The post-war prosperity of the 1950s had convinced a generation of mothers that store-bought was modern and homemade was old-fashioned. But grandmothers remembered, and the inflation years sent daughters back to their mothers' kitchens with specific questions. Oatmeal with molasses. Rolled oats cost 45 cents for a 5-pound canister in 1972 and provided breakfast for a family of 5 for 2 full weeks. No food in the American grocery store offered a better return on investment, and families who understood this ate it every morning without apology. Fried cabbage with bacon. A full head of green cabbage cost 15 cents in 1971. 1 or 2 strips of bacon added another dime. The resulting dish fed 4 people a full vegetable serving at a cost that even the most stretched grocery budget could absorb. When fresh vegetables priced themselves out of working households during the inflation years, families turned to cabbage, the vegetable that kept longest in a cold place, required no special preparation, and yielded more edible mass per cent spent than almost anything else in the produce section. In Irish immigrant households across New England and the industrial cities of the Northeast, fried cabbage appeared at nearly every dinner table in some form. It had survived the famine, the crossing, the tenement years, and the factory shift. Peanut butter on homemade bread. Jif peanut butter sold for 79 cents for an 18-ounce jar in 1973, delivering more protein and healthy fat per dollar than any animal product available. Working families who understood this made it a staple, not a compromise. Scarcity demands nutrition density, and peanut butter's combination of protein, fat, and calories in a stable, unrefrigerated form made it the most useful item in the recession-era pantry. When meat and dairy became weekly luxuries, peanut butter bridged the nutritional gap for families who could not afford to let one go unaddressed. Spread thickly on homemade bread, not thinly the way restaurant menus suggest, but genuinely thickly, the way hunger demands. Peanut butter provided 8 grams of protein and 16 grams of fat per serving. Paired with homemade bread and a glass of whole milk, it constituted a nutritionally complete meal that cost under 20 cents per person. Potato soup with milk. Plain and pale and deeply warming, potato soup built from nothing more than potatoes, onion, butter, and whole milk was the meal that appeared in working households across every American region when the end of the month arrived before the end of the money. During the 1970s recession, a 5-pound bag of potatoes cost 39 cents. A quart of whole milk cost 38 cents. The resulting soup fed 6 people for under $1 and delivered potassium, vitamin C, and calcium in quantities that a box of macaroni and powdered cheese could not approach. Homemade yogurt. Yogurt was nearly unknown in mainstream American supermarkets before the early 1970s, but working families in Greek, Turkish, Bulgarian, and Middle Eastern immigrant communities had been making it at home since their arrival, and the process required nothing more than whole milk and a spoonful of yesterday's yogurt as starter. When whole milk prices rose during the inflation years, families who made yogurt at home effectively doubled the volume and nutritional density of their dairy dollar. A quart of milk became a quart of yogurt with higher protein content, natural probiotics, and longer shelf life, a genuine improvement in every measurable direction. Black-eyed peas with ham. A New Year's tradition in the South that nutritional science has vindicated completely. Black-eyed peas are among the highest folate, highest fiber legumes available, and combined with any cut of pork, they form a protein complement that feeds the body at a molecular level. During the 1970s, a pound of dried black-eyed peas cost 22 cents across the South and the lower Midwest. Combined with ham hocks, smoked neck bones, or whatever cured pork the budget allowed, the resulting dish delivered nutrition dense enough to carry a body through physical labor that modern office workers cannot imagine. Fermented vegetables. Every immigrant community in America brought its fermentation tradition across the ocean, and those traditions kept working families supplied with vitamins through the winter months when fresh produce disappeared and nothing fresh grew. German immigrant families made sauerkraut. Korean and Chinese immigrant families made kimchi and pickled mustard greens. Eastern European Jewish families pickled cucumbers, beets, and green tomatoes. These were not culinary preferences. They were survival technology. The method by which vitamins C and K and beneficial bacteria survived from the fall harvest through the February grocery shortage. Pack shredded cabbage tightly into a glass jar with salt, about 1 tablespoon per pound of cabbage. Press until the cabbage releases its own liquid, submerging itself in brine. Cover loosely and leave at room temperature for 3 to 7 days, pressing down daily until it sours to your preference. Then refrigerate. In Pennsylvania Dutch communities across Lancaster and Berks counties, fermenting crocks sat on cellar floors throughout the 1970s, as they had sat there through every previous decade. Children were assigned the daily task of pressing the cabbage down and checking for mold. They did it without understanding they were maintaining one of the oldest and most effective nutritional preservation systems in human history.
Sloppy Joe sandwiches. The Sloppy Joe wasn't always the cafeteria staple relegated to paper napkin emergencies. In the 1950s and 60s, this ground beef sandwich was picnic royalty, transported in heavy ceramic crocks wrapped in towels to maintain heat. Homemakers browned pounds of ground beef, simmered it with ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and Worcestershire sauce until achieving that perfect consistency between soup and paste. Beef and macaroni salad ring. The Aspic age reached its creative peak with the beef and macaroni salad ring, a dish that embodied everything about mid-century American food culture's obsession with gelatin, presentation, and making the ordinary spectacular. Ground beef was cooked with onions, cooled completely, then folded into a mixture of cooked macaroni, diced celery, and mayonnaise. The real magic happened when this mixture was pressed into a ring mold, chilled until firm, then unmolded onto a serving platter lined with lettuce leaves. The center of the ring was traditionally filled with more macaroni salad or potato salad, creating a dramatic presentation that drew admiring gasps at church picnics. Homemakers spent hours perfecting the unmolding technique, warming the mold slightly, running a knife around edges, saying prayers before inverting it onto the serving plate. When it released successfully, maintaining its perfect ring shape, it represented a victory. Cheeseburger pie. Cheeseburger pie represented the ultimate in picnic pragmatism. All the flavors of a cheeseburger in a format that could be sliced, served, and eaten with a fork from a paper plate. Ground beef was browned with onions, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, then pressed into a pie crust as the bottom layer. The next layer was always sliced dill pickles, their tangy crunch essential to the dish's identity, followed by sliced tomatoes if they were in season. Shredded cheddar cheese covered everything, then another pie crust was placed on top, crimped at the edges, and the whole thing was baked until golden. Beef empanadas. Before empanadas became trendy food truck fare, they appeared at American picnics courtesy of families with Latin American roots, particularly in the Southwest and urban areas with diverse populations. The ground beef filling was simple but perfectly seasoned, browned meat with onions, garlic, cumin, and a handful of raisins that provided unexpected sweetness. Some versions included diced potatoes, others hard-boiled eggs, still others green olives that added salty bursts. The pastry dough was either homemade or, in later years, shortcuts appeared using pie crust or even refrigerated biscuit dough. Each empanada was hand-formed, the edges crimped with fork tines in distinctive patterns that identified the cook. They were baked until golden, then transported in layers separated by wax paper, arriving at picnics still slightly warm. Shepherd's pie cups. Shepherd's pie cups were individual portions of comfort food reimagined for outdoor dining, a stroke of genius that eliminated the need for serving utensils and made portions controlled and tidy. Ground beef was cooked with peas, carrots, and onions in a rich gravy, then spooned into muffin tins that had been lined with mashed potatoes pressed thin to form cups. More mashed potatoes were piped on top using a pastry bag, or simply spooned and swirled with a fork. Then everything was baked until the potato edges were golden and crispy. After cooling, these cups were removed from their tins, wrapped individually in foil, and transported in flat boxes. At picnics, they could be eaten warm or at room temperature, held in one hand like an oversized cupcake, the potato exterior providing structure. Children were particularly fond of these, appreciating the single-serving nature and the way the filling stayed contained. The recipe appeared frequently in the 1970s community cookbooks, often attributed to budget-conscious homemakers. Beef and noodle casserole bars. Beef and noodle casserole bars transformed the humble casserole into something that could be picked up and eaten, a radical reimagining that made them picnic heroes. Wide egg noodles were cooked, then mixed with browned ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, sour cream, and frozen peas or green beans. This mixture was pressed firmly into a greased baking pan, packed down with intensity to ensure it would hold together when cut. Shredded cheese covered the top, then everything baked until set and the edges were crispy. After cooling completely, the pan was inverted, the entire casserole released, then cut into rectangular bars like brownies. These bars were surprisingly sturdy, could be eaten with hands or forks, and transported easily in layers separated by wax paper. They represented the 1970s obsession with making everything portable, with transforming traditional dishes into new formats. Some versions added crushed potato chips on top before baking. Others mixed in cream cheese for richness. Ground beef party loaf. Ground beef party loaf was perhaps the most ambitious picnic creation, a showstopper that required planning, patience, and a certain audacity. Ground beef was mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs, ketchup, and seasonings, then packed into a loaf pan lined with bacon strips that would crisp during baking. But the genius was what happened after the initial loaf was baked and cooled. It was sliced horizontally into 3 or 4 layers, and each layer was spread with different fillings. Cream cheese mixed with chives, processed cheese spread, even egg salad or deviled ham. The layers were restacked. The entire exterior was frosted with cream cheese that had been beaten until fluffy. Then the whole thing was decorated with olive slices, pimiento strips, and parsley, transformed into something that looked almost like a cake. This loaf was transported carefully, served by cutting vertical slices that revealed the striped layers. It was conversation starting, impressive, and absolutely of its era, when such elaborate presentations were expected at any social gathering. Beef and cheese roll-ups. Beef and cheese roll-ups were the simplified version of more elaborate rolled dishes, accessible to even novice cooks but still impressive in presentation. Ground beef was cooked with taco seasoning or Italian herbs depending on the desired flavor profile, then cooled completely. Flour tortillas, a relative novelty in many American homes in the 1970s, were spread with cream cheese or refried beans, sprinkled with shredded cheese, then covered with a thin layer of the cooled ground beef. Beef pickle loaf. Beef pickle loaf was a peculiar creation that combined the meatloaf tradition with the tang and crunch of pickles in ways that seemed innovative at the time, but baffle modern sensibilities. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings as usual, but the twist came from whole dill pickles that were placed in the center of the loaf before baking, sometimes arranged lengthwise, sometimes in a pattern. When the loaf was sliced for serving, each piece revealed a pickle center, the brine having permeated the meat during cooking, creating moisture and unexpected flavor bursts. Some versions mixed chopped pickles throughout the meat instead, creating a more uniform distribution. The loaf was baked, cooled completely, and sliced for transport to picnics, where it was served on white bread with mustard or mayonnaise. The pickle element helped keep the meat moist during transport and serving,